6 weeks into her job at the Naval Medical Center, rookie nurse Erin Daley was deliberately assigned a patient her coworkers believed would destroy her confidence, a deaf war hero, bleeding heavily and fighting anyone who touched him. The senior nurses watched from outside, laughing as they waited for Erin to lose control. But she neither shouted nor called for restraints. She stepped into his sight, raised a whiteboard, and wrote, "You are safe." Days later, surrounded by admirals, the wounded veteran pointed directly at Erin, but what did he reveal that left the entire ward in stunned silence? If you've ever been told that being too kind makes you weak, stay with this one. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. The Naval Medical Center trauma ward operated on a specific kind of rhythm, fast, loud, and mercilessly efficient. Nurses moved between bays with the certainty of people who had stopped flinching a long time ago. They spoke in shorthand, made decisions in seconds, and treated hesitation the way they treated infection. Something to be cut out before it spread. Erin Daley had been watching that rhythm for 6 weeks, trying to find her footing inside it, without losing the instincts that had brought her into nursing in the first place. She had come from a small community hospital in Ohio, where the patient population was largely elderly, and the ward moved at a pace that allowed conversation. She had learned early in her career that telling a patient what you were about to do before you did. It wasn't a courtesy, it was clinical. Fear elevated heart rate, spiked blood pressure, and caused muscles to tighten around wounds that needed to be kept still. Explaining a procedure took 30 seconds. Correcting the complications caused by an unmanaged fear response could take 30 minutes. The math had always seemed obvious to her. It was not obvious to everyone at the Naval Medical Center. Charge Nurse Paige Corrigan ran the trauma ward the way a battalion commander runs a forward operating base through authority, institutional memory, and a complete intolerance for anything that slowed momentum. She was not cruel in any dramatic sense. She was simply efficient in a way that had calcified over years into something that no longer distinguished between cutting unnecessary steps and cutting necessary ones. When Paige watched Erin introduce herself to a patient, before inserting an IV line, she didn't see a nurse building compliance. She saw a nurse wasting time, and she said so loudly in front of 3 other staff members, "This isn't a bedside manner rotation," Paige told her, not breaking stride as she passed. "These patients don't need someone to hold their hand. They need someone who can work." Erin didn't argue. She finished explaining the procedure to the patient, inserted the line cleanly on the first attempt, and moved on. But the comment settled into the ward's shared atmosphere the way these things do. It became permission. Other nurses started echoing Paige's assessments in smaller ways. In the break room, bets were quietly placed on how many more weeks Erin would last before requesting a transfer. She was not disliked exactly. She was just considered soft, and softness in a trauma ward was treated as a structural flaw. What none of them recognized or chose to recognize was that Erin's approach had never been about comfort. It had always been about outcome. She had seen what happened when patients didn't understand what was being done to their bodies. She had seen the difference between a patient who was calm enough to answer questions accurately and one who was too frightened to communicate at all. She had simply never worked somewhere that considered that difference worth measuring. The morning everything changed began without any particular warning. Paige received an alert about an incoming high-priority military transfer. A senior officer with combat-acquired hearing loss, no fluency in sign language, and a documented history of severe trauma responses when physically restrained by strangers. The alert included a flag recommending that staff be briefed on communication alternatives before contact. Paige read it, set it down, and called Erin's name across the nurse's station. She handed over the intake file without the briefing. She did not mention the hearing loss flag. She did not mention the trauma history. She mentioned only that the patient was a difficult case and that Erin had been saying for weeks that she understood patience. Paige's exact words, delivered in front of the morning shift. "You're always telling us you know how to connect with people. Here's your chance to prove it." The laughter that followed was not vicious. That almost made it worse. It was the laughter of people who considered the outcome already settled, who had decided before it began that what was about to happen was entertainment rather than medicine. Erin stood at the nurse's station holding a file that gave her almost none of the information she needed and understood exactly what was happening. She also understood that arguing about it in the hallway would accomplish nothing. So she took the file and walked. She had 15 minutes before the transfer arrived. She spent them at a supply cart pulling a whiteboard and dry erase markers. She found a laminated communication card tucked into the back of a resource binder, a basic grid of medical symbols and phrases designed for nonverbal patient interaction, and she studied it until the images were fixed in her memory. She drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard, a human figure, an arrow pointing to the shoulder, a question mark. She wrote her own name at the top. She reviewed the intake paperwork one more time and found buried in the physical assessment notes a single line that Paige had not flagged patient exhibits, hypervigilance consistent with combat trauma. Unexpected physical contact may trigger acute stress response. She read that line twice. Then she understood what kind of room she was about to walk into. The trauma bay doors came open hard. The gurney came through, fast, pushed by two transport personnel who were already talking over each other about vitals. The patient on the gurney was a large man in a uniform that had been partially cut away to expose a deep laceration running from his left shoulder across the upper chest. The wound had been field-dressed, but the dressing soaked through, and his blood pressure on the transport monitor was dropping in the wrong direction. He was conscious, fully alert, and staring at the ceiling with the fixed expression of someone running an internal calculation about how much danger they were in. His name, which Paige had deliberately not passed along to Erin, was Rear Admiral Russell Keene. What Erin saw when she entered the bay was a man who could not hear the alarms, could not hear the instructions being called across the room, and could not hear the voices of the people moving toward him with needles and equipment. What he could see was a room full of strangers closing in on him from multiple directions while he lay on his back, unable to move freely. For a man whose last experience of that particular combination of stimuli had been the moments after a shipboard explosion that killed two of his crew, the sensory input was not medical. It was tactical. His body responded accordingly. Russell pulled the IV line that had been inserted during transport. He pushed back against the nurse, attempting to restrain his left arm hard enough that the nurse stumbled backward into a supply cart. He swung his legs off the gurney and got one foot on the floor before the blood loss caught up with him and his knees buckled. Two staff members moved to grab him. The room escalated the way trauma rooms do. When a plan stops working, voices got louder, movements got faster, and a physician called across the bay for a sedative protocol. Paige watched from outside the bay window, arms folded with an expression that had not quite settled on concern. Erin said loudly enough to cut through the room noise, "Everyone step back." No one moved immediately. She said it again, and something in her voice, the flatness of it, the absence of panic, made the physician turn toward her. She didn't look at Paige. She didn't look at the other nurses. She walked to the center of the bay, into Russell's direct line of sight, and stopped about 4 feet in front of him. She raised both hands, open palms forward, and held them there. She did not approach. She did not speak because she already knew he couldn't hear her. She waited until his eyes found her face. Then she uncapped the dry erase marker and wrote on the whiteboard, in letters large enough to be read from the gurney, "You are in a hospital. You are safe. I will not touch you without warning you first." Russell's breathing was still fast and shallow from the exertion and the blood loss. His eyes moved to the whiteboard, and then back to her face, and then back to the whiteboard. Something shifted in his expression, not relief, not exactly, but the first crack of recognition that the room contained at least one piece of information he could actually process. He read the words again. He looked at her hands, still open, still. After a moment that felt considerably longer than it probably was, he lowered himself back toward the gurney. He didn't lie down, but he sat on the edge of it and let go of the rail he'd been gripping. Erin held the whiteboard steady and wrote one more line. "My name is Erin. Can I show the doctor where you're hurt?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Behind her, she was aware of the physician recapping the sedative syringe. She was aware of the other nurses watching from outside the bay. She didn't turn around. She stepped closer to Russell, keeping her movements slow and visible, and she pointed to the shoulder diagram she had drawn earlier. She pointed to the whiteboard, then to the physician, and raised her eyebrows in a question. Russell followed her gesture to the doctor, then looked back at her. He gave a single small nod of permission. The team re-entered the bay. They worked, and Erin stood at Russell's left side with the whiteboard translating each step of the assessment before anyone touched him, checking blood pressure. "Now, on your right arm, doctor needs to look at the wound. He'll touch your shoulder in 3 seconds," in plain printed sentences that Russell read and confirmed with a nod or a lifted hand before the action was taken. It slowed the process by a measurable amount. It also meant that Russell remained still cooperative and conscious throughout. No additional sedation was required. No further restraint was attempted. When the physician called for surgical prep, Erin wrote the entire procedure on the whiteboard. In 4 sentences, drew the shoulder diagram again, with the wound location marked, and waited while Russell read it twice. Then she wrote, "Do you want to sign the consent form? You have the right to say no." Russell read it, held out his hand, and signed the form with a steadiness that surprised everyone in the room except Erin. She had made her choice the moment she stepped into his line of sight. She was not going to hand this off, and she was not going to pretend the whiteboard was a workaround for real communication. For this patient in this room, it was the only communication that worked. That made it the most important tool available. She intended to use it for as long as he needed her to. Paige had stopped smiling somewhere around the moment Russell nodded at the whiteboard. By the time Erin walked out of the bay to follow the gurney to the OR, the nurses who had been laughing 40 minutes earlier were not laughing anymore. No one said anything directly, but the break room bet about how many weeks Erin had left quietly dissolved because the terms of it had just become significantly more complicated. The surgery took just under 2 hours. Erin was not in the operating room. Her role ended at the OR doors, but she stayed on the ward and she spent the time preparing. She wrote out a set of orientation cards on sheets of paper torn from a notepad, the date, the name of the hospital, the floor number, a simple drawing of the ward layout. She wrote a sentence she had been thinking about since the moment Russell's eyes had found the whiteboard in the trauma bay. "Russell, you survived. Your crew is not here. You are in the hospital and I am standing next to you." She didn't know for certain that he would need it. She prepared it anyway because the intake notes had described a man who sometimes woke from sedation without knowing which catastrophe he had woken inside of. She was right to prepare it. When Russell came out of surgery and the anesthesia began to lift, his first conscious movement was to reach for something that wasn't there, a railing, a handhold, the edge of something solid. His eyes opened on a ceiling that meant nothing to him, in a room whose sounds he couldn't hear, and his body made the only decision available to it, which was to treat the situation as a threat. His heart rate spiked on the monitor. His hands came up. A recovery nurse reached toward him instinctively to prevent him from pulling at the surgical dressing, and Russell's arm came across in a hard block that knocked a tray of instruments to the floor. Erin was already at the door. She didn't run because running would have added urgency to a room that had too much of it already. She walked in, moved to where Russell could see her, and held up the card she had prepared. She held it steady close enough to his face that even through the residual sedation he could read it. "Russell, you survived. Your crew is not here. You are in the hospital and I am standing next to you." He read it. He read it a second time. His hands lowered by degrees, and the monitor's rhythm began to slow towards something that looked less like alarm. He turned his head until he found her face, and something in his expression, the particular quality of it, the way recognition and exhaustion arrived at the same moment, told her that the card had landed exactly where it needed to. She wrote one more line on the notepad and held it up. "The surgery is finished. It went well." Russell closed his eyes and the tension left his body the way it does when a person finally accepts that the danger has passed. From that morning forward, a pattern established itself without anyone formally deciding on it. Each time Russell woke, regardless of the hour, his first action was to look for Erin. If she was in the room, his body would settle. If she wasn't, he would write her name on whatever surface was available. The notepad on his tray table, the back of a consent form, the corner of a paper cup, until someone went and found her. The other nurses adapted to this without being asked to. Erin began checking on him at the start and end of every shift, keeping each visit brief enough not to be intrusive and long enough to re-establish the fact that the room was still safe. It was on the second day after surgery that the convoy arrived. 3 vehicles pulled into the hospital's restricted lot shortly after noon. The nurses at the station saw the flags on the lead vehicle and straightened without quite knowing why. Vice Admiral Victor Halden came through the main entrance with 4 officers behind him, and the ward's ambient noise dropped noticeably as he moved down the hallway toward Russell's room. Paige met them at the corridor junction, her posture rearranging itself in the particular way it did when authority entered the building. Victor asked directly who had managed Russell's trauma response on the night of admission. Paige began her answer before the question had fully finished. She described a coordinated team effort, referenced the ward's protocol for high-stress intakes, and used the phrase, "under my supervision," twice within 4 sentences. Victor listened with the expression of someone who was listening to more than the words. He asked a follow-up question about the whiteboard, specifically where it had come from, who had written on it, what it had said. Paige's answer became less specific. Down the hallway through the window of his room, Russell was watching. He had no way to hear the conversation, but he had spent a career reading rooms, and he could see Paige's posture and the direction of Victor's attention. He watched until Victor glanced down the corridor and caught his eye. Then Russell looked past Victor to where Erin was standing at the nurse's station at the far end of the hall, reviewing a chart, and apparently unaware that any of this was happening. Russell looked back at Victor and held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Erin again. Victor turned to follow the look. Paige kept talking. What Victor already knew, and what Paige did not realize he knew, was that the surgical record and the intake log told a different story from the one he had just been given. The OR physician had noted that the patient arrived for anesthesia induction cooperative and oriented, which was not the typical outcome for a deaf patient with a documented history of acute stress responses admitted while actively in crisis. The intake log listed the primary nurse on Russell's case as Erin Daley, not Paige Corrigan. Victor had read both documents before driving to the hospital. He had come in part to understand the gap between those 2 facts, and he had left that visit intending to look further. Paige remained unaware of all of this. She felt the conversation had gone well. What followed over the next 48 hours was quieter and more damaging than an open confrontation. Paige submitted an internal incident report, documenting Erin's conduct during Russell's admission. The report alleged that Erin had acted outside her sanctioned scope of practice by unilaterally directing other staff to step back from the patient, that she had created an unsafe delay in surgical preparation, and that her ongoing presence at Russell's bedside reflected a problematic personal attachment rather than clinical judgment. The report did not mention the whiteboard. It described Russell's stabilization as the result of a sedative protocol, which was not what the medical record showed, but was also not something a first-year nurse on probationary status was well-positioned to dispute. The ward's administration opened a review the following morning. As a precautionary measure, Erin was reassigned to a different patient bay and restricted from entering Russell's room while the review was active. Russell noticed her absence within the first hour. He wrote her name on his notepad and held it up when a different nurse came to check his vitals. The nurse told him Erin had been reassigned. He wrote a question on the notepad. The nurse left without fully answering it. By midday, 3 different staff members had seen the same words written in Russell's increasingly deliberate handwriting. Whereas Erin, Page intercepted the last of these nurses in the hallway and said that Erin had been moved to another floor for the week. It wasn't true, but it closed the conversation. Meanwhile, Erin was attempting to navigate a review process that had been designed structurally to be difficult for her to win. The nurses who had been in the trauma bay on the night of admission had seen what happened. Several of them knew the internal report was inaccurate. None of them came forward because the report had been filed by Page, and Page had been running that ward for 11 years, and the calculus of institutional loyalty was not complicated. Erin's account existed in her own words and in the medical record's objective documentation, but interpreting that record required someone willing to read it against Page's narrative, and the administrator conducting the review was not inclined to look for a conflict. What no one anticipated was the whiteboard. A younger nurse, a second year, who had been at the edge of the trauma bay on the night of admission and had watched everything without being close enough to be implicated, found Erin in the break room at the end of a shift and set a whiteboard down on the table in front of her. On its surface, in the blocky capital letters that Russell used because his fine motor control was still compromised from the wound, was a single line. The nurse said she had found it propped against the door of his room that morning and had been asked by gesture to deliver it to the nurse with the short brown hair, who used to come in at the start of every shift. Erin read what was written. "Where is the person who saved me?" She set the board down on the table and sat with it. The review was still active. She had no access to Russell's room, no witness willing to testify, and a report on file that characterized her most important professional moment as a liability. The whiteboard in front of her was the clearest evidence that her account was accurate, and she had no mechanism to formally introduce it into the review. She couldn't use it to defend herself. She could only hold it and understand that somewhere down the hall, a man who had survived an explosion and 2 years of recovery was asking the same question into a silence that no one with authority was currently trying to answer. The review's conclusion was delivered 2 days later. Based on the filed report and the limited testimony collected, the administration found sufficient grounds to recommend termination of Erin's probationary contract. She was called into a meeting with the ward administrator and the hospital's HR liaison and presented with an alternative sign, a document acknowledging unprofessional conduct, and accept a voluntary resignation, which would allow her to avoid a formal termination on her record. She read the document once. She set it on the table. She told them she would not sign it. She said this without raising her voice. What she told them was simple. She had explained a procedure to a patient before performing it. She had asked a patient's consent before touching him. She had used the tools available to her to make a deaf man in a trauma bay feel safe enough to accept the care that saved his life. She was not going to apologize for any of those things, and she was not going to sign a document that described them as misconduct. The HR liaison wrote something in her folder. The administrator said the formal termination decision would be processed by end of business. Down the corridor, staff were arranging chairs for a recognition ceremony. Paige had been asked to speak on behalf of the trauma team. Erin walked back to her locker and began slowly to take her things down from the shelf. The hospital's main hall had been set with rows of chairs facing a low platform, and by the time Erin returned to her locker, the room was already filling. Officers in dress uniform, administrators in lanyards, ward, staff in scrubs, all of them settling into the particular posture people adopt when they are attending something official. The recognition ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and the ward's trauma team had been given reserved seating in the third row. Erin did not have reserved seating. She had a disciplinary folder, a locker half emptied into a canvas bag, and a meeting outcome that had already been decided before she walked into the room. The formal termination paperwork would be processed by end of business. She had perhaps 2 hours left in the building, and she intended to spend them finishing her patient notes and returning her access badge in person, because she had found that small acts of orderliness helped her think more clearly when everything else was in disorder. She was still at her locker when the HR liaison appeared in the doorway of the break room and said that the final meeting had been moved up. The administrator wanted to close the file before the ceremony began. Erin repacked the bag, straightened her badge, and walked down the corridor toward the conference room. The meeting had the atmosphere of paperwork rather than confrontation. The administrator sat at one end of the table, the HR liaison at the side, and a copy of the conduct document was centered in front of the empty chair. Erin sat down. The administrator explained that the review had been completed and the recommendation stood, and that if Erin chose not to sign the voluntary resignation, they would proceed with the formal process. Erin said she understood. The administrator pushed the document a few inches closer to her side of the table. From down the corridor, faint and muffled through the conference room walls, they could hear the sounds of the ceremony beginning, a microphone being tested, chairs shifting, the ambient pressure of a room coming to attention. Paige's prepared remarks, which the ward coordinator had forwarded as part of routine ceremony prep, described the trauma team's response to a high-priority admission and credited the outcome to Paige's decision-making under pressure. Russell Keene's name appeared in those remarks 4 times. Erin Daley's name did not appear at all. Erin sat with the unsigned document in front of her and said for the second time, and with the same quiet steadiness as the first, she would not sign it. The administrator opened his mouth. The conference room door opened. Russell Keene was not walking easily. He was in a hospital gown with a robe pulled over it, his left arm in a sling, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told by 2 physicians that morning that he should be in bed. Vice Admiral Victor Halden walked 1 step behind him, not supporting him, but present in the way that indicated he was prepared to. Behind Victor came the second-year nurse who had delivered the whiteboard, who had apparently decided sometime in the last hour that she was willing to be visible after all. Russell was carrying something in his right hand. As he came through the door, Erin recognized it, the original whiteboard from the trauma bay, larger than the one left outside his room. Someone had retrieved it from storage. The surface had not been erased. The words she had written on the night of his admission were still there, slightly smeared at the edges, but legible. "You are in a hospital. You are safe. I will not touch you without warning you first." He set the whiteboard on the conference table so that the administrator and the HR liaison could read it. Then he looked at Erin for a moment, the same quality of look as the recovery room recognition, and something steadier underneath it, before turning to face the administrator directly. Victor spoke first because Russell's voice was effortful, and he had asked Victor to carry the procedural part. Victor explained that he had requested a review of the trauma bay camera footage and the admission intake logs in the days following his initial visit. He had done this because the surgical record and the intake log were inconsistent with the account Paige had given him in the hallway. The camera footage showed the trauma bay on the night of Russell's admission, the staff stepping back, Erin entering Russell's line of sight alone, the whiteboard being raised, and Russell's physical de-escalation occurring without chemical sedation. The footage also showed Paige Corrigan standing outside the bay window, not inside the room, during the entirety of the critical period she had described supervising. The administrator had not seen the footage. It was apparent from the way he looked at the HR liaison that he had not known it existed. Victor continued. The sedative protocol that Paige's incident report credited with stabilizing Russell had never been administered. It had been prepared and then set aside unused because stabilization had already occurred. The medical record did not support the incident report's central claim. Victor had submitted a formal request to the hospital's military liaison office the previous evening, asking that the review be paused pending examination of the documentary record. That request had apparently not reached the conference room before the meeting was called. Russell had been listening to all of this with the full concentration of someone who could not verify it through sound and was therefore watching every face in the room. When Victor finished, Russell picked up the dry erase marker from the tray at the bottom of the whiteboard and wrote 4 words below Erin's original message. She made me stop. He held the board so the room could read it, and then he spoke. His voice had the uneven cadence of someone who could no longer fully monitor his own volume and pitch. But the words were clear and deliberately formed, and the room was quiet enough that they carried. "The doctors closed the wound," Russell said. "She's the reason I let them." He looked at the administrator. "I was not in that room. I was on a ship 11 months ago, and there was fire and pressure and hands grabbing me from every direction, and I couldn't hear anything, and 2 of my people didn't come back. When I woke up in the trauma bay, I was on that ship. I didn't see nurses. I saw threats closing in on me while I was pinned down. That's what I was fighting." He looked at Erin. She was the only person in that room who understood that I wasn't angry. I was afraid. She gave me something I could read, and it told me I was safe, and that was the only piece of information that reached me. Without it, I would have kept fighting. Someone would have sedated me, and the blood loss during that delay would have been a serious surgical complication. That is not speculation. I have discussed it with the surgical team. The HR liaison had stopped writing. Russell turned back to the administrator. "The nurse you are preparing to terminate is the reason this outcome looks like a success. The person who claimed credit for it was standing outside the room." He set the whiteboard down on the table one final time. "I'd like that distinction recorded accurately." The administrator asked for a short recess. Victor indicated he would remain in the building until the matter was formally resolved. The second-year nurse standing near the door said quietly that she had been present in the trauma bay and was prepared to provide a written statement, and that she had not come forward earlier because she had been afraid of the professional consequences, and that she understood this was a problem she was now choosing to stop contributing to. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Erin sat in a chair in the hallway and waited. When the administrator came back, he told her that all findings from the conduct review had been withdrawn from her file. He said it without elaboration, in the tone of someone resolving a procedural matter. Erin nodded. Before she left the conference room, she asked whether the hospital intended to review its intake and briefing procedures for patients with documented trauma and communication needs, because the conditions that had made Russell's admission dangerous had not been created by Paige's choices alone. They had been created by a system that didn't require the relevant information to reach the nurse before the patient arrived. The administrator said he would take it under advisement. Based on what happened next, he did more than that. Paige Corrigan was suspended from her charge nurse position before the end of the day. The investigation that followed examined the incident report, the falsified account of the sedative protocol, and the documented pattern of withholding patient information from junior staff. 3 other nurses filed supplementary statements over the following week. The process was slow and administrative and unglamorous, and its outcome took months, but it moved in one direction from the day Russell walked into that conference room. Erin went back to work the next morning. In the months that followed, she was asked to join a working group, developing communication protocols for deaf and hard-of-hearing veterans admitted under acute stress conditions. She was the youngest person in the room, and the only one without a title beyond staff nurse. She spent the first meetings listening, and the ones after that pushing for changes specific enough to alter what actually happened in a trauma bay, not just what was written in a binder somewhere. Russell returned to his training work. He ran certification courses for combat medical personnel, and he added one component that had not been there before, a section on recognizing when a patient's resistance is rooted in fear rather than non-compliance, and what it looks like to give a frightened person something they can actually understand instead of applying more force to the existing approach. He never described it as his own idea. He described it as something he had learned from a first-year nurse who had walked into a room that everyone else had written off and found it, as it turned out, entirely manageable. In the trauma ward, the original whiteboard was placed on a shelf in the supply room rather than returned to rotation. No one discussed it directly, but the newer nurses knew what it was, and that knowledge had a weight that altered the room in ways that were difficult to articulate and entirely real. The last admission in this story was a veteran who had lost most of his hearing to a roadside explosion and had not spoken to a medical professional without visible distress in the 3 years since. He was brought in rigid with anticipated confrontation, his eyes already scanning for exits. Erin walked in, set a whiteboard on the tray table beside him, and sat down so that her face was level with his. She wrote, "My name is Erin. I won't do anything until you understand it, and tell me it's okay." She held it up and waited. The man read it once, then again. Then he looked at her face, really looked the way people do when they are deciding whether something is true, and gave a single, slow nod. Outside the room, 3 newer nurses stood in the hallway, watching through the window, saying nothing, and learning something that no orientation manual had ever thought to include. Some people don't prove their strength by raising their voice. They change a room by being the only one willing to stay calm and to actually see the person in front of them. If that kind of story matters to you, subscribe and stick around. There are more of them, and they're worth knowing.